The first thing that struck me wasn't the bone-deep exhaustion hanging in the bruised-looking shadows under Claire Morgan's eyes, nor was it the slight tremor in her normally steady hands. It was the absolute, terrifying stillness of her posture as she held the heavy oak door open. I stood on the sidewalk, the morning sun glaring off the damp concrete of her upscale neighborhood, the jagged metal of my car keys pressing a sharp, grounding ridge into my palm. We had just survived 36 straight hours of a disastrous, high-stakes intellectual property licensing summit, a grueling marathon of lukewarm, bitter coffee, aggressive posturing from rival firms, and worse negotiations. I had driven her home because, after the final handshake, I watched her stare at her phone screen in the sterile lobby of the convention center for 2 full minutes without ever calling a car. Her thumb had hovered over the screen, paralyzed. Now, standing on her porch in the quiet, unforgiving daylight, surrounded by meticulously manicured hedges and the distant sound of morning traffic. I fully expected her to collapse. I expected the polished corporate armor to finally crack and slip to the floor. Instead, she looked back at me, one hand bracing the heavy door, her posture perfectly aligned, her expression an impenetrable calm that fundamentally did not match the utter wreckage of the night before. I didn't know it at the time, but that stillness was the loudest warning she could have possibly given me. "You should get some sleep." "Ryan," she said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, stripped entirely of the boardroom polish and the tactical edge she usually wielded. "I've got the draft revisions to send to the partners at 10, I said, glancing at the cracked screen of the phone in my left hand. "You're taking the day, right? HR mandate after a 48-hour push. I'll be online by noon." She didn't blink. The hem of her tailored beige dress, wrinkled at the waist from the drive, brushed the doorframe. "A clean exit is worth more than a loud win," I told her, repeating the first rule my old mentor, a ruthless litigator named Harrison, had hammered into me during my summer associate days. "We got the licensing rights. We boxed them out of the secondary markets. Let the senior partners argue over the font size and the indemnification clauses today. Rest?" She offered a small, unreadable smile, the kind that didn't reach the amber flecks in her eyes. "Drive safe. The wiper on the passenger side is driving me crazy. By the way." It was a strange, highly specific detail to pull out of a 30-minute, dead-silent drive across the city. The wiper blade on my sedan had been skipping the exact same 2-inch patch of glass for a month, a rhythmic rubber thwack squeak. Thwack squeak that I had long since learned to tune out as background noise. I hadn't realized she was listening to it, let alone cataloging it. "I'll fix it," I said, though we both knew I probably wouldn't. "Text me when you're home," she added. I glanced back at her. "You sound like my girlfriend," I joked. Her small smile returned, but she only held my gaze for a beat. She nodded once and closed the door. I walked back to my car, the quiet, definitive click of her deadbolt echoing down the empty street. I didn't start the engine right away. I sat in the driver's seat, the leather cold against my back, watching the wiper blade resting against the glass. I wondered why a woman who had just masterminded a strategy to secure a $3 million trademark portfolio looked like she was waiting for an executioner. By Tuesday morning, the corporate ecosystem of the 12th floor had returned to its usual frantic hum. My desk was a fortress of manila folders, red-lined contracts, and patent filings. As an IP lawyer specializing in copyrights and negotiation, my job was to find the structural traps other people left in the fine print. I spent my days reading between the lines of non-competes, searching for the exact phrase, the missing comma, or the ambiguous precedent that would lock a client into a corner. I liked the work because it was inherently structural. You couldn't argue with a signature on a dated addendum. You could only dismantle it piece by piece. Claire's office was 3 doors down the hall. As the senior marketing director, she was usually navigating an entirely different kind of warfare: optics, brand synergy, stakeholder placation, and consumer psychology. We had been friendly for 2 years, cultivating the kind of professional proximity that involved sharing subtle eye rolls during agonizingly slow quarterly all-hands meetings and trading dry, cynical remarks by the espresso machine on the ninth floor. I respected her because she never raised her voice to win an argument. She never bullied. She just consistently brought better, irrefutable data. I was 3 hours deep into redlining a sprawling software patent when my phone buzzed violently against the desk with an internal calendar notification. Mandatory review, regional marketing alignment, 3 p.m., room 412. I stared at the screen, my brow furrowing. I was legal. I didn't do marketing alignment. I didn't care about brand synergy or regional demographics. I pulled up the attendee list, me, Claire Morgan, and Thomas Vance, the VP of Operations. A dusty policy mandate from HR required legal presence for any structural department changes involving intellectual property portfolios. It was a bureaucratic technicality, a checkbox for the compliance department, but it put me in the room. When I walked into 412, Claire was already there. She was sitting perfectly straight, but her thumbnail was pressed hard into the side of her index finger. I had cataloged that microtel 6 months ago during a brutal, multi-day deposition regarding a trademark infringement. She only did it when the floor was dropping out from under her, and she never, ever let anyone see it on her face. Vance walked in a moment later, carrying a thick file and smelling faintly of expensive cologne and cheap ambition. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Claire, the board has approved the restructuring," Vance said, dropping the file onto the glass table with a heavy thud. "We're consolidating the brand management tier to the Seattle office. Your portfolio is moving, which means you're moving." The room went entirely, suffocatingly silent. Seattle. It wasn't a promotion, it was an exile. It was a calculated maneuver to get her out of the central hub and isolate her influence. "Effective when?" Claire asked, her voice dangerously level. 6 weeks, Vance said, sliding a thick folder across the table toward her. "The relocation package is standard, generous, even. But given the proprietary nature of the beta launch you're currently managing, the transition has to be absolutely seamless." I watched Claire's hand drop below the table out of Vance's line of sight. She had just closed on a condo in the city 3 weeks ago. I knew this because I had briefly reviewed the HOA terms for her as a favor. A massive, non-refundable deposit, a 12-month renovation contract she had spent months painstakingly sourcing. A forced transfer now wouldn't just uproot her life, it would financially bleed her dry. "And if I decline the relocation?" she asked, her chin lifting a fraction of an inch. "The non-compete clause in your senior executive contract activates automatically," Vance said, offering a sympathetic smile that looked entirely practiced and utterly devoid of warmth. "You'd be locked out of the industry for 18 months. It's in the terms you signed." I reached for the folder before she could touch it. My fingers brushed the heavy cardstock, pulling it into my own space. "Under Section 4 of the IP transition policy," I said, keeping my voice a dry, flat monotone, staring directly at the knot in Vance's tie. "Legal has 3 business days to review any forced relocation that involves active trademark registrations. Claire is the designated brand officer on the Vanguard trademark licensing agreements." Vance frowned, his practiced smile faltering. "That's a formality. Bennett, the board has already greenlit the restructuring." "It's a compliance protocol," I corrected, tapping the folder once with my index finger. "I'll need to review the transfer terms against her original contract to ensure there's no breach of IP security." I didn't look at Claire, but I could feel the weight of her stare on the side of my face. I took the folder and stood up, buttoning my suit jacket. "We'll circle back by Friday." I walked out of the room, carrying the paperwork that held her entire life hostage. That night, the rain started again, a steady, relentless drum against the thick glass of the office windows. I was at my desk at 7, the glow of the dual monitors the only light in the empty bullpen. I had Claire's original employment contract open on my left monitor, parsing through the dense legalese and the new relocation addendum on my right. I was looking for the trap, Vance wasn't sending her to Seattle because of synergy or brand consolidation. He was sending her because she had successfully blocked his vanity project last quarter, exposing its structural flaws to the board, and Seattle was a notoriously effective graveyard for senior directors. I heard the soft click of heels on the carpet, stopping just short of my doorway. I didn't look up as Claire leaned against the frame. "You didn't have to do that," she said, the exhaustion returning to her voice. "Do what?" I asked, highlighting a particularly restrictive subclause in yellow. "Pull the emergency brake in there. Vance is going to put a target on your back. He hates being challenged in front of subordinates." "Vance couldn't find a target with a map, a compass, and a flashlight," I said dryly, turning my chair to face her. "Did you eat yet?" She blinked, entirely derailed by the sudden pivot in the conversation. "What?" "Food, sustenance, the thing human beings require to maintain basic metabolic function," I said, deadpan. "I have half a cold turkey sandwich in the break room fridge that I'm willing to split if things are dire. I think there might be an ancient apple in there, too." A short, genuine laugh escaped her before she could stop it. It broke the tension instantly, changing the air pressure in the room. Then she sighed, her shoulders dropping. "I'm not hungry, but thank you." "Your non-compete is aggressively drafted," I said, dropping the joke and gesturing to the screen. "But it's strictly tethered to your management of the Vanguard IP. If you aren't managing it, the 18-month lockout drops to 6. I can't afford 6 months of unemployment. Ryan, and I can't move to Seattle. I just poured my savings into the contractor for the new place. The permits alone took 3 months to clear." "I know." I watched her process the fact that I remembered the condo details. She crossed her arms, a defensive posture. "So what's the play? I resign and beg a competitor to pay my legal fees when Vance inevitably sues for breach of contract?" "No," I said quietly, holding her gaze. "We don't break the contract. We rewrite the role." Over the next 2 weeks, the policy mandate forced us into near-daily contact. Every time Vance pushed for a transition update, demanding timelines and handoff schedules, I threw up a dense procedural hurdle, citing copyright compliance, vendor licensing audits, and beta launch security protocols. It bought us time, but the clock was still ticking. We started working in her office after hours, away from the prying eyes of the daytime staff. It was a collaborative, grueling grind. We had to build a bulletproof operational model proving that moving her portfolio to Seattle would legally and financially jeopardize the Vanguard trademark licenses. We needed historical data, complex timelines, and granular risk assessments. It was a Tuesday night, close to 9. The office HVAC had shut down for the evening, leaving the air stale and warm. We were standing side by side at her massive whiteboard, mapping out the trademark licensing and launch obligation timeline across multiple jurisdictions. "If Seattle assumes the secondary market trademark licenses," Claire said, capping a red dry erase marker and staring at the board. 3 of the agreements treat that as an assignment and require written licensor consent before the launch." "Exactly," I said, leaning over to check the date on her timeline. "And the current agreements name you as the designated brand officer through final rollout. We need the consent and substitution clauses documented side by side." I reached past her for the eraser. For a second, our arms brushed. I froze, suddenly hyper-aware of the proximity. The faint scent of her vanilla perfume cutting through the sterile office air, the soft sound of her breathing in the quiet room. I could see the exact line of tension running down her neck to her shoulders. I wanted to bridge the 3 inches of space between us. I wanted to put a hand on her back, just for a second, and tell her I had this handled. Instead, I swallowed the instinct, keeping my hands firmly at my sides. I picked up the eraser, wiped out a flawed date, and stepped back to a neutral distance. "We need the vendor contracts from Q2, I said, my voice steady, betraying nothing. She let out a breath, a subtle release of tension. "I'll pull them from the archive." She walked over to the heavy metal filing cabinet in the corner. I watched her pull the drawer open, admiring the sheer competence in her movements. She didn't panic. She didn't complain about the unfairness of it all. She just worked the problem. I brought you something, I said, walking over to my leather briefcase. I pulled out a thermos and set it on the edge of her desk. Earl Grey, 2 sugars, barely steeped. She looked at the thermos, then up at me, a crease forming between her brows. I only ordered that once in front of you, 6 months ago in Chicago during the merger talks. I have an excellent memory for litigation details and terrible beverage preferences, I said. She reached out and touched the metal lid. I actually take it black. The sugar was because the hotel milk was expired. I stopped. A small beat of silence hung in the room. I'd confidently banked a detail, held onto it for 6 months, and gotten it entirely, spectacularly wrong. I'll go pour it down the sink, I said, reaching for it. Don't you dare, she said, quickly pulling it out of my reach. She unscrewed the cap, the steam rising into the air, and took a slow sip. It's perfect. The Friday before the final executive board meeting, Vance finally made his move. I was at the copier, waiting for a massive brief to collate, when the urgent email alert chimed on my phone. I opened it and felt my stomach drop instantly. Vance had bypassed the internal legal review entirely and pushed the Seattle transfer directly to the executive committee as a done deal. The relocation was no longer a proposal. It was a formal, binding offer, effective in exactly 14 days. I left the copies in the tray and walked straight to Claire's office. She was standing by the window, looking out at the city skyline, her posture rigid. She had seen the email. He accelerated the clock, I said, closing the door behind me and flipping the lock. It's real now, she said, her voice hollow, devoid of its usual strength. HR just sent the relocation package via courier. If I don't sign by Monday at 5 p.m., they consider it a formal resignation. Don't sign it. She turned around. The carefully maintained composure was finally cracking. Ryan, I don't have a choice anymore. I talked to my contractor this morning. The deposit for the condo is gone if I cancel the build. If I lose this job, I lose the property. I lose everything I've built here over the last 5 years. I'm not letting him corner you with sloppy procedural tactics. You can't stop this, she snapped, the frustration finally boiling over, her voice echoing in the small office. You're a junior partner candidate. If you block an executive committee directive, Vance will tank your career too. He will make sure you never make partner. I won't let you fall on your sword for me. It's my sword, I said, my voice dropping low and hard, closing the distance between us. And it's my job to read the fine print. I'm not doing this to be a hero. Claire, I'm doing this because Vance is legally wrong, and I abhor sloppy paperwork. She looked at me, a long, searching look that felt like it was stripping away the layers of corporate armor I wore. Why are you fighting so hard for this? Because a clean exit is worth more than a loud win, I said, repeating the rule. And Vance doesn't get a win. I didn't add the rest. I didn't say that the thought of her packing up her life, abandoning the city, and disappearing into a Seattle rainstorm felt like a physical, suffocating weight on my chest. I kept it professional. I kept the boundary intact. Do you want me to take the legal argument into that boardroom? Or do you want the binder in the room? I asked. Claire held my gaze. Build the argument. I'll make the proposal. Give me the weekend, I said, my voice steady. Don't sign anything. The Monday board meeting was held in Conference Room A, the massive one with the glass walls that always made everyone feel like they were in a sterile aquarium. Vance sat at the head of the long mahogany table, looking incredibly pleased with himself. 3 executive board members, including the CEO, were dialed in on the massive video feed on the far wall. Claire sat next to me. She wore a sharply tailored navy suit, her posture flawless. Under the table, I could see the thumbnail pressing hard into her finger. Let's make this quick, Vance said, checking his heavy silver watch. Claire, we need the signed transition documents to authorize the Seattle move and release the relocation funds. Claire looked at him calmly. She didn't reach for the pen lying on the table. Instead, she reached for the thick 3-inch binder I had spent the entire weekend building. I won't be signing the relocation order. Thomas, she said, her voice ringing clear and perfectly steady in the quiet room. Vance's smile vanished instantly. "Claire, we discussed this. The non-compete clause—" "Is invalid," I interrupted, sliding my own copy of the binder across the polished wood table. I didn't look at Vance. I looked directly at the video camera, addressing the board members on the screen. Under Section 8, Clause B of the Executive Restructuring Policy, a forced relocation cannot be mandated if it would place Tier 1 intellectual property licenses in breach during an active launch. Vance scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Moving a desk to Seattle doesn't breach a license. It does when the active agreements prohibit assignment without written consent," I said, flipping to page 4 of the binder. 5 Vanguard trademark licenses name this regional office as the approved operating entity and Claire as the designated brand officer through the launch. Transfer control to Seattle before the counterparties consent, and we trigger suspension provisions on those licenses. The room went completely, utterly silent. I heard a sharp intake of breath from one of the board members on the screen. "Is this accurate, Ryan?" The CEO's voice crackled through the speaker, tight and serious. "I have the executed agreements and assignment schedules on page 6, I said calmly. I had spent 20 grueling hours tracing every consent clause and amendment tied to the beta launch. It wasn't a loophole. It was a set of contracts Vance had never bothered to read all the way through. "This is a technicality," Vance said, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "We can amend the agreements and substitute someone in Seattle." "Not before launch," Claire interjected, taking control of the room seamlessly. She didn't look at me for permission. She owned her domain entirely. "The shortest written consent window is 60 days, and Vanguard launches in 38. In the interim, the launch would stall completely, costing the company approximately $4 million in projected Q3 revenue." Vance opened his mouth, but he had absolutely nothing. He was entirely out of ammunition. "However," Claire continued, sliding a single, crisp sheet of paper toward the center of the table, "I have drafted a counter-proposal. I will remain in my current role, operating out of this office, acting as a direct liaison to the Seattle expansion team. It secures the IP, maintains the critical launch schedule, and completely satisfies the restructuring mandate." She had negotiated her own deal. I just gave her the structural leverage to do it. The CEO cleared his throat on the feed. "Thomas, the IP risk is completely unacceptable. Approve Claire's proposal. We keep the portfolio secure." Vance stared at the paper like it was actively radioactive. He picked up his pen and signed it, his jaw clenched tight. When we walked out of the conference room, the adrenaline was still humming loudly in my ears. We stepped into the elevator, the heavy metal doors sliding shut, sealing us in quiet isolation from the rest of the floor. Claire leaned against the back wall, letting out a long, shaky exhale that seemed to drain the last of the tension from her body. She looked at me, a brilliant, entirely unguarded smile breaking across her face. "You found an assignment clause nobody on the restructuring team had read," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "I read very fast," I said, keeping my hands safely in my pockets. "You saved my life." "I secured corporate assets," I corrected gently, maintaining the dry tone. "You negotiated the terms. You won the room. Claire." She stepped forward. For a second, I thought she was going to hug me. I went entirely still, preparing to accept the contact, to hold the precarious line of professional distance. Instead, she reached out and briefly squeezed my forearm. A simple, grounding, incredibly warm touch. "Thank you, Ryan." The elevator chimed, breaking the moment perfectly. 2 weeks later, the dust had completely settled. Vance was actively avoiding us. The Vanguard launch was on track, and Claire was officially staying in the city. It was 3 a.m. on a Saturday. We had just finished a marathon review session at her new condo, finalizing the last of the dense vendor contracts over terrible, lukewarm takeout. The apartment was still a chaotic construction zone. Bare drywall, taped floors, plastic sheeting over the windows, and a single, wobbly folding table in the center of the kitchen. I was standing by the stainless steel sink, washing 2 ceramic mugs. The quiet of the early morning felt heavy and thick, completely different from the sterile silence of the office. "I should get going," I said, setting a mug carefully on the drying rack. "You have the painters coming at 8. Claire was sitting at the folding table, tracing the rim of her mug with her index finger. She looked up at me. "Ryan." I turned around, drying my hands on a paper towel. "When we were in that meeting," she said quietly, the acoustics of the empty room carrying her voice perfectly, "you put your career on the line to prove Vance wrong. Why?" "I told you, I hate sloppy paperwork." "Don't do that," she said, her voice soft but incredibly firm. "Don't hide behind the job right now." I looked at her. The exhaustion, the paint chips on the floor, the quiet hum of the brand new refrigerator. I thought about the sheer, exhausting discipline it had taken to keep my distance for the last 6 weeks. Consistency as devotion, showing up, doing the work, making sure she was safe without ever demanding a single thing in return. "Because I didn't want you to leave," I said. The plain, unvarnished truth. No jokes, no deflection. She stood up from the table. She walked slowly across the taped floor, stopping a foot in front of me. "Remember when I said, 'Text me when you're home'?" Claire murmured, recalling the exact words from the night I had first dropped her off, months ago. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. I joked, "You sound like my girlfriend." Claire tilted her head, her eyes locking onto mine, clear, deliberate, and entirely awake. "So what?" I didn't move away. I didn't need to. I reached out, my hand resting lightly on her waist, a steadying anchor in the quiet kitchen. She leaned in, resting her forehead against my shoulder. A soft, profound relief washed over me. The fight was over. The exit was clean, and I was exactly where I was supposed to be. 6 months later, the rain was coming down in thick, blinding sheets across the interstate. My partnership review had survived Vance's complaints. The committee renewed my track without conditions. 2 hours earlier, at the Vanguard launch dinner, Claire had taken my hand in front of the regional team and said, "Ryan's my partner." She hadn't added a department, a title, or an explanation. I was driving. Claire was in the passenger seat, reading a dense marketing brief on her tablet, her bare feet resting comfortably on the dashboard. The condo was finally finished. The Vanguard launch was a massive, documented success, and the quiet, stable rhythm of our life had become my absolute favorite reality. I reached forward and clicked the wiper stalk. The blade swept across the glass. On the passenger side, the rubber skipped a 2-inch patch of rain, leaving a perfect, uncleared blur. Claire didn't look up from her tablet. She just smiled. Harrison had been right about clean exits and loud winds. The best ones left nothing to argue about. "You never fixed that," she noted, turning a page. "Some things," I said, resting my right hand on the center console, waiting patiently for her to take it, "are better left exactly as they are." She closed the tablet, slipped her hand into mine, and watched the road ahead. True courage isn't found in loud battles. It's in the quiet, consistent choices that build lasting safety together. Healthy love doesn't demand sacrifice as proof. It protects both people's agency, future, and voice instead of using fear or pressure to keep them close. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this. Tell us in the comments, when did someone's quiet consistency mean more to you than a grand gesture?